This shadow persona I created is a history note taker. So the purpose of this one is I'm having a conversation in the main chat on the left. And what I want this shadow persona to do is just to observe, take notes. So I want to see a summary of what the question I asked was and what the answer I got from the model was, as well as extract out some of the important facts that were mentioned within that response. So you can see my main conversation here on the left. I already have it going quite a bit. And what I'm diving into is the history of the Revolutionary War in the USA. So I'm just asking general questions about it that you can see on the right, such as when did the Revolutionary War start? What was the war about? Why did it start? So let's see this in action. It says right here, George Washington was commissioned into the Virginia militia. Let's learn more about that. Tell me about the Virginia militia. And with my main chat, I'm talking with Gemini 2.5 Flash, and I also have RTD enabled. I'm using Tavily for the RTD provider. So let's just ask the question. And I got kind of a short response. But then on my notes on the right, if I scroll down to the bottom, I could see that question answer. Let's ask one more question. How about what were the colonies? And let's see what we get back for this. Okay, so we see the 13 original colonies and our answer, and now the shadow persona is going to add that to the table. And for this shadow persona, I told it to put the new responses at the very bottom of the table, which does make me have to scroll down every time. All right, some information about the shadow persona. So if I click on the ellipses right here, and then click on Edit Shadow Persona, you can see that I have a underlying persona, which I also called the History Notetaker, and we'll take a look at that in a bit. But right now I'm having this update after every new message. But maybe for the purpose of what I'm trying to do, which is, hey, just sequentially write notes for each of these conversation points I'm having, maybe a better one would be to use manual only. That way the table's only updated when I manually click the button to have it updated. And maybe that will be a little less distracting. And I don't really need the shadow persona to provide its own response, provide its own updates after every single response that I get from the main model. Sometimes that might be a little bit distracting. In this case, maybe it is. So I'm going to just set that to manual only. And then messages per split. This is pretty important actually for the use case for this persona. So if I want this persona to summarize my full conversation, then I want to make sure that it has access to all those messages within this conversation. So I had it set to 20, but if the conversation ever goes past 20 messages, then I'll need to update this to more messages, like 30 messages, 50 messages, whatever it might be. And for max versions at the very bottom, I don't need to hold on to every single response that I get from the shadow persona. So I had this selected as 5, but maybe I really just want 2. I want the most current one and maybe the one before that so I can compare them just if I need to. But I really don't need to hold on to the default, which was, I think, 10. So I'm going to save that out. But now let's ask another question. And then my expectation is that the shadow persona won't update until I actually click on this button right here. And then ultimately, it's only going to hold on to 2 responses. So the last question I asked was about the colonies. Who were the colonies involved? What were the colonies involved? And I see the list of 13. Maybe my question now is, well, out of those 13 colonies, what was the first one? Okay, and you can see that I'm getting a response from the main model here, and my shadow persona is just holding tight, which is good because right now I want to focus on the main conversation and not really the shadow persona. And with this, I see Virginia was really the first colony, and Jamestown, I guess, was the first town, right? But let's find out more about Jamestown. Okay, so I got this response about Jamestown, and then the prior response about Virginia. And I haven't clicked on the button yet for my shadow persona to update the table. So at the very bottom, you can see that there's just 10 results, which do not include anything about Virginia or Jamestown. So let's click on the button to manually process. And then now we have that response. So I have number 11 for what were the colonies. So I guess I did ask about this before I had the shadow persona reprocess. And then let's see, 12, what was the first colony? Talks about Virginia, and then Jamestown, more information about Jamestown. All right, and then we could also see that the output is now just 2. So I have this latest output and the previous output. And with this, the shadow persona has provided me a good table that was following along with the main conversation that really focuses in and provides just the main summary for each of the messages, as well as highlights the important facts for each of them. So I could just take this, copy it, and paste this somewhere else if I want to take this table and do something else with it. But what I want to show you is a little bit about the persona that I use for this. So let's go into the persona section and then History Notetaker. This is how I set up this particular persona with the system prompt. So the shadow persona's directive is review the conversation that I'm having with the main model, extract some of the key information. And I have some criteria here for how the responses should be formatted and some important guidelines to follow, some constraints, and example output. Providing example output is super beneficial in conversations where you want it to appear in a certain way. One last thing, if we scroll down, I had this set to Gemini 2.5 Flash, which is, of course, an online model. But if you wanted to use something like this with a local model, GPT OSS 20B is a pretty good one. And with that, this is Llama CPP. I'd recommend clicking on the model parameters and then setting that to default max for the NumCTX. And the reason why you want to do that is this is the context limit. So as these conversations get bigger and longer, then you're going to want the local model set to a higher context limit. That way it sees the full conversation from beginning to end and then responds accordingly. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then it's probably going to just see part of the conversation and give you a response, and then that response is going to look like a hallucination because it's not getting enough context. Set the context limit to a higher value. That way it doesn't look like it's hallucinating.